Humans have been playing board games for at least 6,000 years, maybe even longer, much longer. This is a pastime that has endured for millennia, but before the likes of Monopoly, exploding kittens and snakes and ladders, what board games were early humans playing? How complex were they, and would we find them fun to play today? In this episode, we're going back to some of the earliest board games ever discovered, from Bronze Age Egypt to the Roman Empire, and we'll explore one incredible mystery, a 2,000-year-old game that no one understood until recently, when my guest today used AI to finally decode how it works. I'm Ollie Guiu, and this is What We Did Before, the podcast that charts the history of everyday life. I just want to welcome the many new people who've discovered the podcast recently. Thank you for joining us. Please subscribe if you get a chance. It helps out massively. Now, let me introduce you to Walter Crist, an expert in the archaeology and history of board games based at Leiden University in the Netherlands. Walter Crist, welcome to What We Did Before. It is a pleasure having you on the show.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for reaching out and thanks for having me. Yeah.
I'm just so fascinated that there is a sort of a field of expertise that can explore the archaeology of ancient board games. That is just incredible to me. How far back in history do we see the earliest evidence of humans playing board games?
It depends on how you want to interpret the archaeological evidence. For sure, we can see back to about almost 6,000 years ago. The first thing that we can really say is a gaming set was buried with a woman in a tomb in Egypt. It's this little clay table with a set of pieces, and it's now in a museum in Brussels. But that's the first thing that we can really say, okay, this really looks like a game, the kind of games that we recognize as board games now. But you can look a little bit even further back to that, and there are other things that look like game boards, even going back 9,000 years ago. There's some kind of discussion amongst archaeologists and other games experts whether these are actually games back that far. I tend to think that they could be. And part of this uncertainty has to do with how we play and things that we play with. So archaeology can tell us really when people start making things that look like board games. But if you look at ethnographic evidence, people tend to play with holes or lines on the ground and grab some stones and then play like that. Those are things that archaeologists are very rarely, if ever, are going to find. And I think that was happening a long time before people were actually making things. So as far as we can tell, for sure, 6,000 years ago, maybe 9,000 years ago, and before that, who knows?
Yeah, I do wonder if, as you know, somebody in your profession, whether you sort of look at many things and go, well, that could be a board game.
Yeah, I mean, I do certainly. Other archaeologists often overlook the possibility that something can be a board game. So we have, for instance, all these little clay objects that are often cones or discs or other small shapes that are the shapes that we typically see for game pieces. But people, attribute them to other kinds of interpretations. But I'm looking at them, I'm like, those look a lot like game pieces to me. So a lot of it is like having the eye for what it is and what it can be. I think games have been somewhat overlooked in archaeology as something that's not important, because we should be talking about politics and economics, the important stuff. But I think the evidence is there. We just have to start looking for it a little bit more carefully.
Yeah, I guess because even if you were to be a modern board game was to be placed in front of you and you were told play, most people would have no clue. Like, okay, what do I do? Is there a dice involved in this? Am I supposed to be moving in a clockwise direction? Like, without a rule book, you have no clue where you're at. And it's the same with the archaeology, right? You're maybe dealing with old, ancient sort of stone tablets which have inscriptions on it, but beyond that you don't have a rule book, you don't have necessarily all the pieces that we use to play a board game. It becomes quite difficult, and you can just use that as a modern comparison, quite difficult to even figure out where to begin.
It can be very difficult. We have certain clues for certain games at certain times in certain places. When we know that our game exists, we'll usually have the board and maybe some pieces with it, maybe dice if it has dice. Occasionally, we have artistic representations of people playing games. You see a lot of, for instance, Egyptian tomb paintings that show people playing games, so we know they exist. More rarely, you have some written information about them. So in those same tomb paintings in Egypt, you'll have captions of the players speaking, and often they will be saying something that's happening in the game. So you'll have like these little snippets, which are really cool. But yeah, rules, and especially complete sets of rules, are very, very rare, especially in the ancient world, because what we're talking about here is something a little bit different from what we usually experience now, even though we do still experience it in a similar way. These kind of traditional board games, which are the kinds of things that you learn growing up, or learn from your parents, learn from your siblings, learn from friends, or maybe you go someplace else and learn it from somewhere in a faraway land. These are the kinds of games that everybody knows how to play. It's the kind of thing like tic-tac-toe or checkers or things like this that we all know. We probably never read the rules before we played it. We probably don't even remember when we learned. We just always know. Versus the kind of commercial board game where, okay, you have to write down the rules so that you can sell it to somebody who's never met the creator of it, right? That's what we're dealing with in the ancient world, are these kinds of traditional games. And so we can get bits and pieces from the archaeological, the artistic, and the textual representation and the textual evidence for it. And then what we tend to do is look toward ethnographic evidence for other kinds of traditional games and draw from that to kind of try to make conclusions about how you might be able to play a game that looks a certain way.
It's really interesting that you bring up checkers because, or drafts as well. I inherited a really old copy of drafts from my nanny when she passed away. It was the one thing I asked to keep from her house, and all my sisters got various other things and trinkets that they remembered her by. But that was the one thing I really remembered her by, was this draft set. And she, taught me how to play, and eventually I could beat her even as a very young child. And you mentioned just how important board games should be in archaeology, but perhaps aren't. And actually, I think that's a very small demonstration of just how important they are in sort of early development and in creating bonds and forming relationships and memories as well. I don't know. I feel like it's just a subtle hint towards why board games are important to investigate.
Absolutely. This is something that my research has focused on, kind of the social importance of games and how they function as a kind of social lubricant between people, right? And this is how you see board games spreading across the world, pretty easily in terms of ideas, because it's not just that the game helps you to interact with other people, but it's also, you can see it spreading in a way that you may not be able to see other kinds of ideas spreading. Certain games are tied to certain cultures. They are really kind of embedded and traditional to that culture, and it gets passed down through generations, like drafts, like your grandma's drafts. And it's interesting because it can change through time as well. So I assume that you are playing what we call English drafts, but here where I live in the Netherlands, they play it differently. It's on a 10 by 10 board rather than the usual 8 by 8, which is a really interesting thing, how it can change through time. It can even become very specific to certain locations. So it's a part of our heritage, but it's not something that has been really focused on a lot, in part because it is a little bit intangible.
And you mentioned that perhaps we've seen some evidence from 9,000 years ago of these early board games, and that obviously agriculture really sort of got going 10,000 years ago. Do we think there were board games or hints of any board game playing without having archaeological evidence of that happening before agriculture? Or do you think it really only started manifesting once we were able to sort of stay in one place for a long time?
The way I see it is that we start seeing it archaeologically with agriculture because people are starting to settle down, and then you can make things specifically for playing with them that you then keep, that you wouldn't want to be carrying around with you if you're a hunter-gatherer or a nomad in some way. Then also what you really start to get is, of course, the accumulation of wealth. And so then you can take the time to spend thing that you can just play with. Right? The the game set from Egypt, even though it was on a simple clay, it was a simple clay table. The woman that it was buried with had gold jewelry and other things in her tomb. So she was a wealthy person. So there is a connection there, and you see it all through history, this kind of conspicuous leisure almost, where some people have the ability to be able to spend time and resources on playing that others don't. And there is plenty of ethnographic evidence that, hunter-gatherers, people who are not really practicing agriculture, do play board games, but it is this more kind of, the game lives in your head, and then when you want to play it, you make it, you gather the things you need, and then you do it, and then it's gone. So you don't have to carry it around with you.
I want to talk about something that you recently were able to uncover using AI, which I find absolutely fascinating. So you used AI to figure out the rules of a stone game board dating to the late Roman Empire, which is this incredible discovery where I think the story goes that you were sort of just walking past it in an exhibit or something like that. Could you tell us about this discovery?
Yeah, sure. So it was actually, I believe it was 2021. It was a break in COVID lockdowns, and I needed to get out and go see some ancient stuff, go to a museum. And there was a museum nearby where I was living, in the town called Haarlem here in the Netherlands, where there was a Roman bathhouse, and they've excavated it and built this really nice museum around it. And on display, they had this object that was a stone with a bunch of lines and a geometric pattern on it that they had on display as a Roman game board. It was interesting to me because the pattern on the board was unlike any other game board that I had seen. It wasn't a pattern I recognized. A lot of the times you will see that the geometric pattern of the board is a very specific shape, like drafts is an 8x8 board. So is chess actually, but you have other games where like backgammon, for instance, that's a very distinct board, and a lot of ancient games are like this. This one was completely different from anything I had seen, so I was a little bit skeptical about this identification. So I reached out to the curators. They said, "Yeah, come and have a look at it." And so I was looking at the surface of the stone, and I noticed that along one of the particular lines on the board, you could see that it had been worn smooth through use. This is something that, I'm primarily a prehistoric archaeologist, so I usually focus on the Bronze Age. So we tend to look a little bit more closely at objects because we have less written sources to deal with. So we have to really look carefully at the objects to see how they might have been used. And so this stone was worn smooth in this one particular place, around this one of the lines in particular, and it was about the width of a Roman gaming piece. So as if you were sliding along that line many, many, many times, you're playing it a lot, you would wear down the surface of the stone to make it smooth. So I said, okay, that might change my mind, because I was leaning towards saying, no, this probably isn't a game. It's not anything like anything we had seen.
And what was this called? The actual stone on display?
It was just object 04433 or whatever the number was. Yeah, it was just, it didn't have a real name. It was just a game board from the area. So yeah, the bathhouse where the museum was built was part of a Roman town called Coriovalum that, like you said, was around during the Roman Empire through the late Roman period. And the stone was probably found. We tried to find if there were any kind of records for where it was found specifically, but it seems to have been brought to the museum by somebody who just kind of dug it up as they were building something. In probably, judging by the way that it was recorded in the museum's catalog, it was consistent with late 19th, early 20th century recording practices, which is when the town was really kind of booming and growing. So we did some 3D imaging of the object to kind of look more at the surface to see if there were other areas where the smoothing could be seen that was not visible to the naked eye, but that we could use the imaging to enhance that. And we could see that, yeah, the greatest area of smoothing was the one that I could notice, but then there were other places where it was a little bit less pronounced, but you could still see that it was there. And it was all around where the lines were. There are certain places on the board where the lines aren't, they're too far away for a Roman game piece to have touched them. those parts, there was no smoothing in those areas whatsoever. I also looked at it with a microscope just to confirm that like the surface of the stone looked like leveling was going on the stone grains, and I looked there and it did. So then, okay, so it looks like it could have been used for a game based on the way that this object was used. Because it was a unique object, it was not obvious what kind of game this might be. So what we did was we looked to the ethnographic and historical evidence. And we had been, as part of the project I was working on, we had compiled a database of over 1,000 historical and traditional and ancient board games and what we knew about the rules for them. And so we looked at that database, kind of filtered it for games that were on small boards with like around 25 or less places where you can play, looked for those that were around Europe. And we found a suite of different kinds of games that were, some of them were the kind of tic-tac-toe board where you get 3 in a row, well, a little bit more complicated versions of that. But also there were a bunch that had this kind of goal where the point of the game is to block your opponent from being able to win. So one person has more pieces than the other. The person with more pieces has to block the person with fewer pieces. And we found evidence for this in Scandinavia mostly, but also some in Greece and Italy for actual like documentation of the rules for these. But then there's archaeological evidence going back even into the Viking period for boards that look like those games. So we said, okay, so we took all the different possible rules for these different games and adapted them to the board because the geometry is different, of course, so things will have to be changed. There's also some like uncertainty about where the lines actually are supposed to line up on this board. It's a little bit sloppily made, which board games are often. And so we put all these different rules on the board from those that we had from the historical and ethnographic sources with different piece types, different winning conditions on the different boards. We ended up with 130 different possible rules. And then we had 2 AI agents play the games according to those rules against each other 1,000 times for each different rules combination. So in total, 130,000 games. As they were playing, we had them track where the pieces were moving. So as they moved along the different lines, because we did see in the evidence on the actual stone is that one of the lines was used way more than the others. So we wanted to find rules that would replicate that. We ran all of the AI simulations. Then we kind of filtered through the results and eliminated the ones that didn't fit. We selected for the ones that had this one diagonal that was used more than it, like twice the mean is what we picked, but more than it would be expected. And then we kind of filtered out, some of the rules had certain lines used that were also quite a bit used, but we didn't see evidence for that on the stone, so we eliminated them. And through this process of elimination, we were able to narrow it down to 9 different types, 9 different rules that were consistent with what we see on the stone, and they were all this kind of blocking game. So that's what we think is most likely that this board would have been used for playing this kind of blocking game.
It's an incredible process, and to me, it sounds like such a deep, rich process for you as a researcher to go through. How long does a process like that take?
Well, I mean, it took a lot of thinking because it's not something that had ever really been done before, right? And I was working at the time with a bunch of computer scientists we were actually trying to find ways to use AI to study games, but we were kind of looking in a different direction on that. We were looking at kind of using procedural methods to reconstruct games, but this was a little bit different. This was a very kind of focused research question. Some of the challenge as an archaeologist is also having the conversation with the computer scientists because we speak very different languages, and they have a lot of ideas for what they can, what the AI can do, and I have different opinions on how that actually reflects on the archaeological evidence. And vice versa. I have like, oh, well, can't you just do this and it will just calculate everything? Well, not really. So it was a long process to kind of figure out, okay, what do we need to do? How do we make these results actually reflect something, and not that we're just kind of shoehorning rules into this board to make it work. Yeah, it was a challenge, but it was cool in the end.
Yeah, I'm actually in the process of designing a board game for my 5-year-old because I really wanted something to play with her, which was enjoyable for me as well and not purely luck-based. And I've been playtesting it, and maybe we've done 50, 60 playtests. Here you're saying that this AI, or the two AIs sort of fighting up against each other, were able to do, what did you say? 130.
1,000. 1,000 for each game, so 130,000. Yeah,
130,000 playtests, which you would not be able to do in your career. So it's it's amazing what AI is allowing you to do. Do you think without it you would have been able to figure out what the likely rule set of this game was, or do you think that would have been almost impossible?
I mean, we could have done it and we could have gotten some results. We could have tried to get as many people to try to play the game and track each time they make a move where they move it. Like, it's very time consuming. So we could have done it. We probably wouldn't have done it with so many different rule sets. We probably wouldn't have had quite as big a sample size. And then it's not quite as convincing, I think, in that way, right? On the other side, AIs don't play like humans do. So they play to win at all costs, or at the very least to not lose. So it can be challenging to use AI simulation in this way. For a small game like this, though, it seems like the AIs do kind of play like a person, because the method that we use is it kind of looks forward into the possible moves ahead and then chooses the best one. Which, for a small game where there are not a lot of choices and not a lot of options for where you can move, that's kind of how humans play as well. So we don't think it's too far away for a very simple game like this. But that can be a challenge for more complex games, let's say.
I love the idea of sort of going back in time and telling somebody from the Roman Empire that their game had been played by two machines.
Yeah, right.
This unbelievable sort of scope of history where we suddenly been able to do this, and an ancient person might be completely bewildered by that fact. Have you played it yourself?
Yeah, because I have tested it out and tested it out with students as well. Just because okay, the AI could have produced these results, but is it actually a playable game is a different question. And yeah, it works. It's not the most exciting game to ever be played, but it doesn't have to be. People still play tic-tac-toe, and we all know that's not the most exciting game either. So
Do you spend a lot of time playing ancient board games then, or not just for work, but have you ever landed on anywhere where you've thought, actually, this is really fun, I'd love to play it again with friends?
I mean, I do end up playing it a lot with friends because they want to learn, and they're like, oh, let's do it, and I also do like a lot of events at like museums and stuff where we have people come and play. So I do end up playing and showing people a lot how to play these games. And yeah, I mean, it's surprising how the kind of longevity some of them have. The Royal Game of War, especially, you might have seen that on YouTube. We have a fairly good idea of how that game was played. And
tell me all about it.
So, I mean, the Royal Game of War, it comes from the ancient city of Ur, which is in Iraq. It's from ancient Sumer, so it's one of the older games. It's about 4,500 years old. Several examples of it were found during excavations at the royal tombs there in the 20s and 30s. So that's why we call it the Royal Game of War, because it came from the royal tombs there. And we have a text from much after that has some information about the rules, and you can kind of draw a line back to that from other things. Other examples in ethnography that can give you a good estimation of how this game was played. And there are like YouTube videos of it was Irving Finkel, who was a curator at the British Museum, who found a tablet that was in the British Museum that had these rules, or at least the parts of the rules that were able to help us learn how to play them. So a lot of people have seen that, and like it's really evocative of the point that games in the like simple form have not really changed so much in all these thousands of years, and it still can like it's the rules are very abstract. Maybe they weren't to ancient Sumerians, maybe they had specific meanings, but in the way that they play, there are lots of games that are very kind of similar to this even today.
So have you got a favorite ancient board game that you've played?
I mean, that one's probably the most fun to play. My favorite ancient game is the Egyptian game Senet, which is the one that I've done a lot of research on. But I don't know, the rules that we've tried to reconstruct it with, it leaves a little bit to be desired. So I think we're missing something, but I don't know what that is yet. But yeah, I think the royal game of Ur is, or actually it changes its geometry, or people change the geometry of the board at a certain point in time. And we call that the game of 20 squares because we don't know the ancient name of it, and it has 20 squares.
So very imaginative,
really, really creative, right? Well, that one has a little bit more drama than the royal game of War. It lasts a little bit longer, and the part of the board where both players are playing is a bit more. It's a bit longer, so there's more player interaction in that one. So I think that one's actually the better of the ancient games.
Well, tell me about Senet, because as you mentioned, you've researched this a lot, and it was found actually sort of throughout ancient Egypt, right? It was quite common as a board game.
Yeah, Senet is one of the longest lasting games of human history. So it was played for at least 3,000 years in ancient Egypt. It's a game that, at least at a certain point in time, had a certain kind of religious connotation to it. So it has 30 squares that are arranged in 3 rows of 10. Each square represents a portion of the journey from the point of death into the actual afterlife. So there are certain, in the Egyptian cosmology, there are certain challenges and things that you have to pass through in order to actually get to the afterlife after you die. At least at a certain point in time in Egyptian history, the game it seems to have meant to represent that, because we have texts that talk about this journey, and there are a couple of boards that have markings in each square, and each square is one of the stages in this journey. So it's very kind of clear. But it was a game that was played by everybody in Egypt, and there were, for example, four Senet game boxes were found in the tomb of Tutankhamun. We also find it in graffiti on monuments and in the workers' village of the people who built the tombs in the Valley of the Kings. They had all of these limestone chips left over from digging out these tombs, and some of them have games drawn on them. So we know that it was played by all kinds of different people in ancient Egypt all through time. It also spread outside of Egypt to the east coast of the Mediterranean and to Cyprus and down into Nubia as well.
And is that unusual, would you say, in terms of ancient board games, that such a vast portion of society would have played? Because you mentioned this sort of 6,000-year-old game, and it was buried with a rich woman, and people who had the time to sit down and play games and the luxury of leisure time. So is Senet a bit unusual in that respect?
I don't know that it was unusual. So I think it's hard to know much about the game that that rich woman was playing 6,000 years ago, because it's the only one that we have. I would presume that other people were also playing it and just like digging holes in the sand. But like, she was special. She had like the set made for her. And this is what you see. This is like, Tutankhamun has his 4 very fancy. He has like this big ivory and ebony table that's on this big stand in his tomb. But then everybody else is just playing on the ground, right?
He got the collector's edition.
Yeah, exactly. He had the connections to get it's specially made. It is an interesting question, though, of like, do people play by the same rules, and is the meaning always the same across all of these different social classes? Because if you have, at the same time when Tutankhamun had Senet in his tomb, this was the time period when it had the very close connection to the journey from death to the afterlife. So is the way that you play that game, that you play Senate, really reflective of that journey? And does that meaning translate always into the way that everybody plays it? I don't know, and we probably never will actually know that. But there are some indications that some of the markings on some of the fancier boards, are a little bit more strongly reflecting this religious tradition. Some of the more simple ones have no markings whatsoever, or they're just like X's or something. So it's the connection and the iconography isn't really there. So it's hard to say, really.
Amazing. Yeah. And I mentioned before about my daughter's board game. I made it because, just pure luck-based games are a bit boring for an adult.
Sure.
They seem to be quite prevalent in children's games.
Mm-hmm.
And it made me wonder actually whether ancient games were more luck-based, or skill-based, or whether it was a sort of combination like we would see in the modern day. Do you get a sense of that?
From what we can tell, it seems to be that a lot of the most ancient games have some sort of dice involved with them. So there is an element of chance or luck. But I don't think they do not seem to be pure luck, where you just throw the dice and move, like Snakes and Ladders or something like that. Most of them have, multiple different pieces for each player. So you roll the dice, but then you have to also make a choice. And so there is an element of strategy that is involved in these games. It's like backgammon, for instance. Like there's a considerable amount of luck, but you also have to know how to use that luck appropriately in order to be able to win. We don't see, or at least it's not very obvious to us, that there are games where there is just strategy, like games like chess or checkers or things like that. You start to see that in ancient Greece. They have some games that we know had no dice and were like that. And then, of course, you start to see Go in China and East Asia, and chess shortly after that. It could be that these games also existed in earlier times, but they were not as popular. My kind of interpretation of that is sometimes these games that are only strategy based can be tedious for people. Not everybody wants to be able to be good at those games. You have to like really practice at it. And you like chess, like if you play chess against someone who knows how to play chess, it's not very fun, right?
No.
So games that have the chance element make them more exciting because anybody can win. Even if you are really good at backgammon or the Royal Game of War, you still might have bad luck and lose. So I think chance as sort of this leveling mechanism, or the dice as this leveling mechanism in games, I think has a lot to do with their sociability and why they are popular at this time.
I wondered whether there was any connection. You mentioned that there was potentially this sort of religious spiritual connection to Senate, but whether the element of luck ever played into ancient ideas of like fate and fortune, whether you see any of that in like the texts that have been recovered.
There has been a lot of kind of suggestion that board games are in the past were a form of divination, which I think is a little bit overplayed. As archaeologists, we want to find things, or the tradition of archaeology has been that we want to find important things to say. And so religion is one of these important things that we want to say something about. But I don't think everything has to be like that. I think there are some indications in some places at certain points in time that there may have been use of games for divination. So we see, for instance, the game of 20 squares that I mentioned. In a couple of places or at least in one place in Lebanon, the game is on this object that is shaped like a liver. And we know that they were using hepatoscopy or like liver divination. They would take the liver of a sheep, I believe, and look for imperfections or whatever in it to then say something about whatever the question was being asked. And it has 20 different sectors that you have to kind of check and interpret, the same as the game. So there's this one object from this one place that has this kind of pretty evocative connection between the two. But I don't think the game always has this, right? at least not in this formal kind of connection between fate and the future and being able to tell it. Now, on a more kind of casual, believing in, superstition and luck and chance and fate, you see that all across all kinds of games everywhere.
And I'm quite fascinated to hear, dice have been used as part of these games for, well, pretty much as long as we can go back and see them and find them. And I wondered, well, one, why are dice so enduring? We got evidence of sort of ancient bone dice even, haven't we, from archaeological past? And then also, what other game pieces would have been used and perhaps have sort of survived into the modern day that we see now?
Yeah, I mean, dice are various forms of dice, because it's not just your typical cubic six-sided dice, they are very old. They go back at least 5,000 years for cubic dice, but you can use anything that has two distinguishable sides as a form of dice. Cowrie shells, for instance, are commonly used across cultures because they have the mouth and the round side, and you take 4 or 5 of them and throw them, then you get a value from throwing that, right? You can even have sticks or reeds that are split in half the long way, and you could throw them that way. And yeah, the bone dice that you were alluding to, I think, are the knuckle bones, which are specifically the talus bones of usually sheep or goat they basically function as a D4. They have 4 distinct sides that you can throw them. They're used for lots and lots of different things. There's a lot of different kinds of uses for those things, but in ancient West Asia, we know for sure they were used especially for the game of 20 squares that I mentioned. They were found, some of the ones that were in Tutankhamun's tomb had them in the drawer. So, and people were also, interestingly, making artificial versions of those bones out of things like ivory and glass or metal.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's an interesting little thing that people did, because the form of it also had some kind of meaning. You could just make a little kind of rectangle and mark it with numbers, but then it loses the meaning that it had. So yeah, dice are one thing. And then for most games, it seems like up until chess really evolved and came about around the middle of the first millennium AD in India, most games involved players having pieces that were of one type per player. So you could have multiple, like for instance, Senate had 7 pieces per player, but each player had, all of the same pieces. They weren't distinct from one another. They seemed to have had the same kind of properties. And they're cones. You would recognize these as, some of them are, these kind of like conical shapes with a little knob on top. That's like the basic shape of a game piece nowadays, and like that goes back to the earliest games. So yeah, some of these things are really enduring.
Yeah, it's amazing that we sort of stumbled upon almost the perfect formula, and we decided, well, we'll just stick with that for the rest of time now. The dice work, yeah. These cone-shaped things work, yeah. Let's just keep those forever.
Yeah.
Why boards in particular? Because I sort of think that even post-agriculture, when we start to see these emerge, when people were a bit more settled, still the day wasn't like we have now, where we've just got sort of quite a lot of leisure time. We've got quite a lot of time just sitting in our living room, able to sit down and play. Sort of 6,000 years ago, we would have been much more active. The need to work the field or whatever it was would have been much greater. So it seems almost antithetical to think that we would have gravitated towards this still board where we have to sit for a long time and strategize and think. And I don't know. Yeah. Have you got any theories on why boards became this so culturally important thing?
It's hard to say for sure, right? Obviously. But I have some ideas. So the first thing is that I think that hunting and gathering people actually had more free time than we think they did. And people have studied and done ethnographic work on today's hunter-gatherer people, and they do have a fair amount of free time. It differs between different societies and what environments they're living in, etc. But some of them even have suggested that they have more free time in some places than we did.
Yeah, I've heard that actually.
Yeah. So I think that has part to do with it. I think another thing that has for boards specifically, I think over the past kind of 150 years, board games, this has changed recently, but there has been sort of an infantilization of board games in that they are something for kids to do, right? And this is why there are so many simple and boring ones. But there was a period in like the 20th century, especially, that like board games were like work for kids. They're supposed to like learn something from it. But if you look at traditional games cross-culturally, it's not true everywhere, but a pretty common thread that you see is that it's something that older people play. Not just like adults, but like also like older adults. So I think part of that and has to do, yes, we were a lot more active as hunter-gatherers, but as you get older, you may not want to be quite as active all the time, right? But you still want to be social in some way and play and enjoy your time in whatever way you can. And so it keeps your mind active. It keeps you social by, having this interaction with other people. I think for me, that's kind of where I see it coming about. Of course, none of this can be proven, but
no, but you've got a pretty good educated guess given the field in which you study. But
I think it makes sense. Yeah,
yeah, it does. Yeah, it's logical to me. So I do want to discuss a few other ancient board games of interest. There's this game, Hounds and Jackals.
Yeah, so Hounds and Jackals is another one of these where we don't know the actual name of it. We call it Hounds and Jackals now because one of the first ones that was found was actually found by Howard Carter, the guy who is more famous for discovering Tutankhamun's tomb. He keeps coming up. But he found this board that's now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art that had 5 pieces per player. One player was jackals and one was hounds. We don't actually know the ancient name of that one either. You also will see that called 58 holes sometimes because it usually has 58 holes. This is a game that I had done a little bit of research on before. It seems to have been a game that appears around 4,000 years ago. And it interestingly kind of appears everywhere in Egypt and like West Asia. I had done specific research in Azerbaijan, where the nomadic peoples that were living there, so they were probably cattle herders, had some examples of this game. So it was interesting that they were playing this game, that the cow herders in Azerbaijan were playing the same games that pharaohs in Egypt were playing at this specific time period, which was really cool.
You can imagine Tutankhamun doing sort of a viral Kickstarter, and that's why it suddenly appears
something
across.
Like that. Yeah. If only. But it's interesting. It has been kind of in the literature that it originated in Egypt because it had the ones that were possibly the earliest came from Egypt, but re-looking at the evidence, it seems to be more Mesopotamia, Turkey area, where the strongest evidence for this game's origins comes from. But it was particularly popular at that very early period, and then it did continue on for another 2,000 years, specifically in Mesopotamia. But it kind of disappeared from Egypt after about 500 years or so.
Bound to get bored of the board game eventually, right?
Yeah, I mean,
after a few thousand years.
Yeah, after a few thousand years, it seems to be. I think that it seems to be the case that there are particular games that are particularly tied to certain economic systems at certain periods of time.
Monopoly.
Yeah. So, and as those systems, because as I mentioned before, they are they're social lubricants. They help people to interact with one another. So if you go somewhere far away and you want to have an economic interaction with that person, you can play a game with them. You don't necessarily even have to speak their language to be able to communicate how to play it. And you can tell things about how people operate by how they play a game, right? Are they playing fairly? Are they trying to cheat? Are they bragging? All this kind of stuff. So you can initiate an economic interaction in that way. that then has consequences afterwards. And so games can spread along these economic systems in this way. And then when it collapses, they kind of seem to go back to where they were locally popular before that.
I wonder if a game like Monopoly will eventually disappear if we ever move to sort of like a post-capitalist society, or something different, some other, because no economic model really lasts forever, does it? So that at one point in history, something will change. And I wonder if Monopoly will fall by the wayside, because we just think that as like a staple of board games in the modern age, don't we?
Yeah, I mean, it is in a way our traditional board game nowadays. Everybody knows it. Nobody actually reads the rules. You just learn it at some point growing up. And maybe it will continue after, because the origins of Monopoly are as a critique of capitalism, actually. And then it was kind of then co-opted and kind of did a complete 180. I'm sure that if capitalist systems collapse, there will be different kinds of board games that have different kinds of values, and the distribution will be different too, because the way that we get and encounter new games is so tied up in capitalism, right? So, it's interesting.
And I recently saw an article about the Phaistos disc, which is this ancient clay disc from Bronze Age Crete. And the article sort of went into how, although originally thought to be an example of archaic writing, this article was suggesting it might be, in fact, an ancient board game. So this the Phaistos disc is sort of roughly 16 centimeters in size, covered with 241 stamped spiraling pictographic signs. So you could see where this assumption could have been made. Have you got a take on the Phaistos disc? Have you looked into it?
The Phaistos disc plagues me. It's a weird artifact, and in some ways, it's like the one that we did the AI study with here in the Netherlands, because it is a unique object. It's something that nothing else exists like it. It's this disc that has these signs that are not found on anything else. No other disc like this exists, so it's a really weird thing. And I have seen, it has been suggested many times since it was found about 120 or so years ago, that it's a game. But it doesn't quite fit in with what I would expect a game to look like. So we have other games that we do know existed from Bronze Age Crete. They are circles. They're rendered as circles of holes of either 10 or 12 in number. And also there are some that are grids of varying numbers of holes, and they're on pavements at the palaces in Bronze Age Crete. So in public places, things that look like where games would be played that we can tell ethnographically and historically. This object, the Phaistos disc, it doesn't show, like, we use U-square to look at this unique object. So we said, okay, this thing has a unique pattern on it. Let's try to look at it to see if there's any indication of how it was used. And so that's how we made the step from, okay, this is a weird object, to, okay, it actually could have been used in this way because the object itself is telling us this. There's the Phaistos disc has been studied to death. There's no sign that it was used in anything. So for any kind of play, you have to have the interaction of the pieces on the surface of the board. And it doesn't look like that kind of thing was happening on this object. It does have a spiral, and we do know of the Egyptian game Mehen, which is in the form of a coiled serpent. But it's very different from that, because on the Egyptian game, you just have a bunch of different squares that are in a spiral. In this one, in the Phaistos disc, you have each individual sign that sometimes the different signs repeat throughout the spiral. They're broken up into sections. It's something that's really quite different. And another thing that you always have to be careful of is that you can make almost anything into a game. So if it's a geometric pattern, you can make a game out of it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it was used as a game in the past. There's a lot of speculation around what the Festus could have been. There's even speculation of whether it's even genuine. So I am not convinced.
Well, nearby Crete is Cyprus, right? And Cyprus was a hotbed for board game activity, wasn't it?
Yeah. So that's actually where I got my start researching board games, was in Cyprus. So I don't think they were particularly stronger or more active gamers than anywhere else. They just, for some reason, in ancient Cyprus, in Bronze Age Cyprus, so from about 2,500 BC until 1,000, they were making games out of stone. So they were very simple games. It was just like blocks of limestone, very rough, barely shaped, if at all, with series of holes in them. And there are hundreds and hundreds of them. There's almost 500 as of the last count. Probably just because it was locally available. This is the stuff they were building their houses out of also. So it was just lying around, and it's really nice to make a board game and play on there. It's really cool because it allows us to, so yeah, like I was saying, like usually people would just make stuff out of things that would never survive. Even if they do make game objects, they're often wooden or would have been made out of wood, which won't survive in all climates archaeologically. So the fact that they're making them out of stone in Cyprus helps us to see them, and really indicates, because you have, they're not living in very big cities on the island at this period of time. They're really small villages. Every house seems to have a board game in it. So it's really striking to me, like the connection that, this is something that people were doing in their everyday lives, even in these like small village societies on the island.
And that they cared so deeply about it is amazing. Everyone had a board game cupboard even through antiquity. I love it.
Yeah.
Has there been any attempts to sort of recreate and commercialize any of these old games?
For sure.
Or is that not really a thing? Oh, there has.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah. The Royal Game of War is a big one. You can buy it from the British, because the British Museum has a board for it, like an actual board, and they sell it in the gift shop, and you can find all kinds of places online. I had the Senate board that I have, which is obviously not a real one, but I was actually given that as a teenager, which is funny because I had never even ancient games weren't even like on my radar at that point.
Wow.
But then I was like, wait a minute, I have that somewhere. Yeah, so yeah, you can buy many of them online. Senate, the Royal Game of War, some of the ancient Roman and Greek games as well.
And so when do we see this sort of move to what we would consider now to be more of a modern type of board game, the likes of Monopoly, not carved into a rock? When does that emerge? Has it been most of human history where that rocks have been sort of the primary material that we've used?
Well, I don't think stone is ever the primary material. I think it's usually just on the ground somewhere has been the typical material. I think you can see this process in different stages, and it's really just a question of where you want to draw the line. So one point is that woman's tomb in Egypt, when you have something that's made specifically for playing a game. That's one point. Then you have another point in the Middle Ages, I would say, where you have the Game of the Goose, which comes about. I don't know if you know that one. It's something that...
No.
So it's another one of these boring chance games. But it starts in Italy with the advent of the printing press. So it's just it's a spiral thing where each player has one piece. You throw the dice and you move, and then sometimes you have to go back, sometimes you go forward, sometimes you miss a turn. It's like this basic kind of game. There's no choice whatsoever in there, so there's no strategy. But what's important about it is that they're printed for the first time in Europe, at least, and they're printed with the rules on them. So that's another major point in time where you get, okay, now you can have a game that you can sell, and you don't have to teach somebody to it because the rules are there. And they get different versions of it. They start to get different themes. So, during the colonial period, it's about traveling the world, and at the center of the game is France or something. communicating certain kinds of ideologies there. And you have a wide variety of different themes in this game because it's easy to make that from printing it, and you can really represent it on paper better than like traditional games where there might be a theme that it's more kind of abstract and you really have to kind of imagine it, whereas you start to really see it as part of the game itself. And then kind of, I guess the third point that I would say is another point where you could say it starts is in beginning around the Industrial Revolution. And this is the point in time where you are really starting to get conspicuous leisure becoming a real thing, and also commercialization of games. So you have people who are trying to create new games in order to sell them to new markets. You're getting people who have time to play games, so the market is being created. Then you get this kind of snowball effect where so in order to sell a new game, you have to create a new game and you have to create new rules that haven't been invented before. And so you get like this increase of complexity. And then that it continues to now where we have some like really, really complex games, right?
Yeah, like my co-host Matt, he recently, I think he had to read in on the rules for about 2 days for this game, Twilight Imperium. And Twilight Imperium takes 12 or more hours, especially if you've got new players to complete.
Yeah.
And you just can't imagine in the ancient world, one, that they would want to spend 12 or more hours playing, and two, that the complexity would have been even needed because there's this financial incentive.
Yeah, exactly. Like, yeah, I've been playing this game with my friends here. I think it's called Oath. I don't even remember. But like you play it through once and then you like have to put it away in a certain way. And then the next time you play, it's kind of like modeling a society that goes through many ages. So like it's so complex. Traditional games, you have to memorize the rules because it's not written down. So like you don't get complex rules like this before then.
What I find amazing is that board games have endured despite video games being available, despite AI being able to play board games and also solve board games. Despite all of this, we still love board games. We cherish them. We even saw AlphaGo, the AI designed to be the best Go player in the world, beat the world champion Lisa Doll a few years ago, and AI is only getting better, right? So how do you feel knowing that AI can now just solve board games and beat world champions?
It's no big deal to me. I mean, for me, the point isn't for humans to be able to win, or the point of the game isn't being able to win or be the best at it. I know that this is definitely the motivation for some people, right? But the fundamental thing about board games for me, is the social aspect of them. And so you're doing something with a group of people, and maybe even just two people, and you're sharing this time together and you're doing something together. And that's the important part for me. And I think there is still value of being the best human that can do it. So yeah, we know so much that machines can do so many things they're more capable of doing so many things than humans are. So what? People still, you have machines that can lift giant things, but you still have weightlifters.
True.
It's whatever. Machines can do so many cool things and so many big things, but it's also, in a certain way, you could kind of be poetic about it and be like, still being the best human to be able to do something. There still is value in that, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I think, going back to making this game with my daughter, I kind of, with everything you've laid out here, it makes me feel quite connected to our ancestors, to this urge to invent games. And it was something clearly that they've been doing for thousands of years and that they really wanted to do. And so I wonder if, to you, as an expert in this area, whether you think board games reveals something deeply human about us and something that's been true for thousands of years that lasts to the modern age.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is this kind of desire for connection and shared experience, because even though it is something that is sort of contrived, it's something that you do with somebody else, and that you have You build connections with people through doing that. And I think that is the most human thing. And also on a certain level, like the act of doing this in a board game is one of the things that has endured and has not really changed so much. It has really stayed the same the most in comparison to other things that humans do. We still, you see an ancient board game on a table and it has the board and the pieces, and like, what you're supposed to do with it. You may not know the exact rules, but like, you know what's going to happen. You're going to move them through the spaces or whatever. It fundamentally has not changed in at least 5,000 years. And I think that's really cool. And it really can help people to connect with the past. And it's a thing like, yeah, you could learn how to make clothes like ancient people did, or build houses like them, or make pottery, or cook food, or whatever. But it takes a lot of effort to do that kind of stuff. You could do it. But playing a game, it's very simple. You don't have to learn a lot of new skills to do it. It's the same thing now as it was back then. So now I think that's really cool about it too.
Yeah, that is really cool. Well, Walter, Crist, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Really, really fascinating diving into the history of board games. Thank you for joining What We Did Before.
Absolutely. I was happy to do it. I hope you enjoy it.
What a legend. A huge thank you to Walter Crist. And I'd love to know, have you ever played any ancient board games like Senate? Let me know wherever you're listening. Now, in a few days, I'm releasing something special on the YouTube channel, a deep dive into that Roman board game Walter helped to decode, where I'll actually show you how it works using my own recreated version of the board. So if you want to see this ancient game brought back to life, make sure you're subscribed over on YouTube. And as always, if you've enjoyed this episode, please follow or subscribe wherever you're listening. It makes a huge difference. I'm Ollie, and this is What We Did Before. See you next time.